When Lily suggested we take a weekend trip to the mountains, I was thrilled. We'd been talking for months about needing to escape the city grind, and it seemed like the perfect way to reconnect. I pictured us waking up to crisp air, sipping coffee on a cabin porch, maybe hiking a trail or two, then collapsing into a cozy firelit evening. So, when she said she'd take care of the plans, I didn't think much of it. I trusted her. But when she dropped the itinerary into my lap a week before we were set to leave, my excitement froze. "Is this a joke?" I asked, flipping through the pages of what looked more like a military operation than a vacation. Every minute was accounted for, from the time we'd leave our apartment to the exact point where we'd stop for gas. Lily, sitting on the couch with her laptop, gave me a flat look. "No, it's not a joke. I just know if I leave it up to you, we'll wander around wasting time like we always do." Wasting time? My voice climbed before I could stop it. Since when is relaxing wasting time? I thought this was supposed to be a getaway, not a boot camp. She rolled her eyes, which only made my blood boil. "Relaxing is fine, but you'll just sit around the whole weekend and then complain we didn't do anything. This way, we make the most of it." I tried to stay calm. "But did you even think about what I might want to do? Look at this. A 6 a.m. sunrise hike? You know I hate waking up early." "Okay, but you'll thank me later. The view is supposed to be amazing. And 3 hours of wine tasting? I don't even drink wine." Her jaw tightened. "Fine. So what's your brilliant idea? Do nothing? Just lay around?" "That's not the point," I snapped, slapping the paper onto the coffee table. "You planned this whole thing like I'm just a tag-along on your perfect trip." Her eyes narrowed. "You're being dramatic. I put so much effort into this because I wanted it to be great for both of us. But, of course, you can't even appreciate that." At that point, the fight felt less like an argument and more like a staring contest where neither of us would back down. So I did what any rational person in my position would do. I decided to take matters into my own hands. That night, while she slept, I pulled up her itinerary on my phone. If she thought she could just bulldoze me with her plans, I'd show her how it felt. I deleted the spreadsheet, then started fresh. My trip, my way. By the time I was done, I felt smug. No rigid schedule, no crack of dawn wake-up calls, just a couple of fun, easy activities and plenty of downtime. I didn't say a word to her until 2 days before we left, when she casually mentioned the packing list. "Oh," I said, feigning innocence. "I made a few adjustments." Her face froze mid-sip of coffee. "Adjustments?" I slid my version of the itinerary across the table. She skimmed it, her eyebrows creeping higher with every line. "You deleted everything I planned?" "Not everything," I said, leaning back in my chair. "I kept the hike, but at noon, when normal humans are awake." "And what about the dinner reservation I made at that mountain restaurant? You replaced it with takeout pizza?" "It's about the vibe," I said, as if that explained anything. Her coffee cup hit the table harder than necessary. "Are you serious? You didn't even talk to me about this." "Exactly. How does it feel?" Her mouth opened, then shut, then opened again, like she was trying to process my audacity. "This is so immature. I planned that trip to make it special for us, and you ruined it." "Oh, you mean how you planned it to make it special for you?" That was when things escalated. She stormed off to the bedroom, slamming the door behind her. I heard furious typing and then the distinct sound of her phone ringing. A few minutes later, she reappeared, arms crossed. "Well, congratulations. The trip's canceled." I blinked. "What do you mean, canceled?" "I called and canceled the cabin. You can have your vibe right here in the apartment." I stared at her, dumbfounded. "You're joking. Does it look like I'm joking?" The absurdity of it hit me all at once. This trip, which was supposed to be a fun escape, was now a nuclear battlefield of petty revenge. Neither of us was willing to give an inch, and now we were both stuck at ground zero. I wanted to call her bluff, to demand she rebook the cabin and admit she was overreacting. But part of me knew I'd pushed too far. Still, I wasn't about to let her have the last word. "Fine," I said, grabbing my keys. "I'll go on the trip without you." Her laugh was sharp and humorless. "Good luck. You don't even know where the cabin is." "Don't need a cabin," I shot back, though I had no idea what I meant by that. I'll find my own getaway. She didn't respond, just turned on her heel and went back to the bedroom, slamming the door again for good measure. I stood there for a long moment, seething, before finally grabbing my phone and scrolling aimlessly through travel sites, trying to figure out if there was anywhere I could escape to at the last minute. Spoiler alert, there wasn't. Flights were too expensive, nearby hotels were booked solid, and my resolve to make her pay crumbled as the night went on. Eventually, I gave up, crawled into bed beside her, and stared at the ceiling. She was facing away from me, and the silence felt heavier than the argument had. We didn't talk the next day, or the day after. The weekend came and went, and instead of sipping coffee on a cabin porch or hiking any trail, we both sulked in separate rooms, each silently convinced the other was more at fault. By Monday, I was so fed up with the tension that I almost apologized. Almost. But she beat me to it, sort of. I shouldn't have canceled the cabin, she said, arms crossed and voice stiff. But you were a jerk for changing everything without telling me. I only did that because you planned everything without asking me. I shot back, even as guilt twisted in my gut. She shook her head, exasperated. Do you even hear yourself? And that's when I realized we were right back where we started, both convinced we were justified, neither willing to admit we might have gone too far. So now I'm here, typing this out, wondering, AITA? Every fight with Nora was like entering an emotional escape room. Intricate, high stakes, and requiring at least 2 steps to unlock what the hell we were even mad about. This time, the room was a parking lot, of all places, and the puzzle? Whether the giant inflatable flamingo we'd bought for our beach trip could fit in her car. It started when I suggested deflating it. Reasonable, right? The flamingo was so obnoxiously large that it made Nora's little hatchback look like a clown car. But no, Nora had spent a full 45 minutes inflating it, and she was not about to undo her masterpiece. If we deflate it, it's never going to look this good again, she said, her hands on her hips. Her hair, messy from the sea breeze, stuck to her cheeks in strands. You don't just deflate art. Nora, I said, carefully, like one might address a feral raccoon. It's not art. It's a pool toy. Her eyes widened, and I swear, for a second, I thought she might actually hiss at me. It is not a pool toy. It's a statement. What's the statement? I have zero spatial awareness and terrible taste in beach accessories. I regretted the words the moment they left my mouth. Not because I was wrong, but because Nora had this way of making you pay for sarcasm in emotional currency. Oh, I see, she said, her voice dangerously sweet. So now you're too good for Big Flambe? Too sophisticated for the joy he brings? Big Flambe? I blinked. You named it? Of course I named it, she said, as if I'd asked whether the sun rises in the east. You don't just bring a soulless, unnamed inflatable into your life. I pinched the bridge of my nose. We're going to miss our dinner reservation. We wouldn't miss it if you stopped standing there whining and just helped me figure out how to fit him in. He's not going to fit. He's basically a giant pink colon with wings. Let's deflate him, go to dinner, and we'll reinflate him tomorrow. Nora crossed her arms. You deflate Big Flambe, and I swear to God, I'll deflate your sense of self-worth. Wow, I said, laughing in disbelief. You're really going to make this flamingo your hill to die on? Big Flambe is not just a flamingo. He's an experience, a vibe, a companion who doesn't mock me over parking lot logistics. Okay, well, Big Flambe's vibe is currently ruining my vibe, which is hungry person trying to get to sushi. You always do this, she said suddenly, and there it was, the pivot, the moment every minor spat with Nora turned into a referendum on our entire relationship. You can't just let things go. It's always about being right. Oh, and you're the queen of flexibility? I shot back. You literally started a war over an inflatable bird. It's not about Big Flambe, she yelled, throwing her hands in the air. It's about you being so dismissive all the time. You think everything I care about is stupid. That's not true, I said, though my voice faltered. She wasn't wrong. Nora's enthusiasm for random, over-the-top things sometimes baffled me, and maybe I wasn't always great at hiding it. But it wasn't malicious. I just didn't always get it. She gave me a pointed look. Last week, you rolled your eyes when I wanted to stop at that lavender farm, because we had already stopped at 3 roadside attractions. And 2 weeks before that, you made fun of my idea to take pottery classes. That was a joke, Nora. I wasn't. It wasn't funny. She cut me off. Do you ever think that maybe I like these things because they make me happy? That maybe I want you to be part of them instead of treating me like I'm some quirky side character in your life? Her words hit harder than I expected. I don't think you're a side character. Then why do you act like I am? She said quietly, and for the first time, there was no fire in her voice, just hurt. I looked at Big Flambe, its stupid cartoon eyes gleaming under the fluorescent parking lot lights. Nora's whole personality was like that flamingo. Bright, ridiculous, and unapologetically too much. I loved that about her, even if I didn't always know how to show it. You're right, I said, the words feeling strange in my mouth. I've been a jerk. She blinked, clearly caught off guard. Wait, what? I've been dismissive, I admitted. And you're not wrong about me needing to be right all the time. It's not my best quality. Nora squinted at me like I just sprouted a second head. Are you dying? Is this a terminal diagnosis situation? I laughed, despite myself. No, I'm sorry, okay? I don't want to make you feel like the things you care about don't matter. She was quiet for a moment, her fingers fiddling with the hem of her shirt. I don't want to fight, she said finally, her voice softer now. I like silly things. I like us doing silly things. That's part of why I love you. There it was. That word, love. She didn't say it often, and when she did, it always had the weight of something fragile but powerful, like a glass ornament you weren't sure you deserved to hold. I sighed, stepping closer. I love you too, and I'll help you fit Big Flambe in the car, even if it means we have to sit on his stupid wings the whole drive. Nora's smile was hesitant at first, but then it broke wide and bright, like the sun coming out after a storm. Deal. We spent the next 15 minutes wedging the flamingo into her car, its neck sticking out the passenger window like some deranged mascot. It was utterly ridiculous, and yet, as we drove off, laughing, wings flapping in the wind, I couldn't help but think, this was us. Messy, frustrating, absurd, and somehow perfect. But seriously, AITA? The night started with an accidental click. Finn wasn't supposed to be on that part of the internet. He'd started with harmless boredom, scrolling forums, checking out conspiracy theories, laughing at the ridiculousness of it all. But then there was a link that led to a forum that led to a chatroom. And there, in a thread titled Midnight Architects, Finn found himself spiraling into the unknown. The premise was simple, or so it seemed, a challenge to build the most unique home in the void. It was a creative exercise, Finn thought, some kind of community art project. The instructions were oddly specific. Draw your design on paper by hand. No computer-generated images. Post it under a username of your choosing and wait for feedback. Finn was always game for weird little competitions like this, so he grabbed a notebook and started sketching. The rules insisted on black ink only, so Finn used his finest pen to draw. His house design was whimsical, perched on stilts with spiral staircases leading to nowhere, windows set at impossible angles, and a rooftop garden filled with carnivorous plants. He labeled it the Infinite Perch, snapped a photo, and uploaded it. Within minutes, comments poured in. Perfect balance of chaos and symmetry. Approved. Welcome to the architects. Exceptional work. Have you built before? Finn laughed, a little unsettled by how serious they sounded. It was just a drawing. How could anyone have built it? He replied with a quick, nope, first-timer, and shut his laptop. Time to get some sleep. But sleep didn't come. At 3 a.m., Finn woke to a noise he couldn't place. A hum, low and steady, vibrating through his apartment walls. When he turned on the light, he saw it. The notebook, sitting open on his desk, though he distinctly remembered closing it. And the page with the Infinite Perch was blank. Before he could process what was happening, his phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Blueprint received. Prepare site. Finn stared at the screen. His heart hammered against his ribs. It had to be a prank. Maybe the forum had some kind of bot that pulled his contact info? But how? His curiosity itched harder than his fear. So he typed back, "What site?" The reply came immediately, "You'll know." Against his better judgment, Finn grabbed a jacket, pocketed his phone, and stepped outside. The hum was louder out here, resonating through the pavement. Without thinking, his feet moved. Down the street, through the park, past the closed library. It wasn't until he reached the abandoned lot on the edge of town that he realized he wasn't alone. There were others, dozens of them, standing in silence, clutching sketchbooks, notebooks, and loose sheets of paper. Some looked dazed, like him. Others stood with an air of calm authority, as though they had done this before. In the center of the lot, the ground began to ripple, shimmering like water. The hum grew louder. Someone next to Finn whispered, "First time?" He turned to see a girl with bright green hair and a notebook tucked under her arm. She looked younger than him, maybe 19, but her eyes were tired, like she hadn't slept in weeks. "What is this?" Finn asked. "Your first build," she replied, as though that explained everything. Before he could ask more, the ground split open and a structure began to rise. It was the infinite perch. Every detail from his sketch was there. The impossible angles, the spiral staircases, the carnivorous gardens swaying unnaturally in the wind. It was bigger than he'd imagined, towering, menacing, alive. The girl grabbed his arm. "You have to claim it." "Claim it? What does that mean?" he stammered. "Touch it. Acknowledge it's yours, or it will consume you." Consume him? Finn didn't have time to argue. The perch loomed above, the windows glowing faintly, the air around it vibrating with energy. He stepped forward and placed a hand on the cool, black surface of the nearest stilt. The humming stopped. A voice, deep and resonant, filled his mind. "Architect Finn, welcome. The void awaits." Finn stumbled back, gasping. The girl caught him before he hit the ground. "Congrats," she said with a wry smile. "You're officially one of us." "What is this place?" Finn demanded. "What did I just do?" She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You built your first house in the void. You'll build more. We all do." "Why? For what?" Her expression darkened. "Because they need places to live." Before Finn could ask who they were, the perch groaned, shifting slightly, as though settling into place. The ground sealed up beneath it, leaving no trace of the shimmering void. The other architects began to disperse, their faces unreadable. Finn wanted to chase after them, to demand answers, but his body felt heavy, drained. "You'll figure it out," the girl said before she turned and walked away. "Or you won't." Finn stood alone in the lot, staring at his creation. The infinite perch stood silently, its windows glowing faintly, as though watching him. His phone buzzed again. Next blueprint due in 7 days. He didn't know what scared him more, the text or the fact that part of him already had another design in mind. The house smelled of her favorite lavender candles, a faint but poignant reminder of her presence. James had not extinguished them since the wake, not entirely ready to let the memories of her slip away. Her belongings were still where she had left them, neat and purposeful, as if she would walk back in any moment and scold him for rearranging anything. He couldn't bear to change it. Not yet. Her clothes, hung with care, still carried her perfume, the scent wafting faintly whenever he opened the closet. This was his private shrine, the space where her essence lingered. 6 months after her passing, James still found himself tangled in the web of grief, not quite ready to return to a world that seemed too eager to move on. His sister, Sarah, had other plans. At their mother's birthday gathering, she had cornered him in the kitchen, her tone a practiced blend of casual and pleading. "I've been thinking," she began, her words soaked in a syrupy sweetness that made his skin crawl. "You know, about Laura's clothes. It would mean so much to me to have something of hers to remember her by." James didn't flinch this time, though the audacity of her request still made his stomach churn. This wasn't the first time Sarah had brought it up. She had broached the subject at the wake, of all places, and James had brushed her off then. He had hoped that would be the end of it, but Sarah was persistent. he sighed, setting the plate he had been drying on the counter. Laura wanted them donated to the women's shelter, he said firmly, the words rehearsed but no less resolute. Sarah's expression darkened, her mask slipping. Donated, she spat. To strangers? That's selfish. Typical Laura. Even in death, she... Don't, James interrupted, his voice cold and sharp. His hands trembled, but he kept his gaze steady. Don't you dare speak about her like that. Sarah recoiled slightly but rallied. I'm just saying it's not fair. She always thought she was better than everyone. Why should her clothes go to people she didn't even know when her own family could? Enough. His voice rose this time, enough to silence the chatter in the next room. James took a step closer, his eyes blazing. I would rather burn every last piece than let you have them. Do you understand me? Those clothes were part of her life, her kindness. You don't get to tarnish that. The room fell silent as their mother entered, her face a mix of curiosity and concern. What's going on? She asked, her gaze darting between her children. Ask Sarah, James said, his voice hollow now, the anger drained, leaving behind a weary ache. He grabbed his coat and the gift he had brought, walking toward the door without a backward glance. James, wait, his mother called, but he was already gone, the weight of the confrontation pressing heavily on his chest. The drive home was a blur. He barely remembered turning the key in the ignition or the sound of the gravel crunching under his tires. Once inside, he slumped into the couch, the silence of the house wrapping around him like a suffocating blanket. The tears came then, unbidden and hot, spilling over as he buried his face in his hands. Grief, anger, and exhaustion swirled together in a tempest he couldn't escape. Later that night, he found himself standing in front of the closet. He opened it slowly, the scent of lavender and Laura's perfume enveloping him. His hand grazed the fabric of her favorite blazer, a deep navy piece she had worn to countless courtrooms and mediations. He could almost hear her voice, steady and commanding, the way she used to speak with such conviction and compassion. James thought about the women who would wear these clothes next, women fighting their own battles, seeking second chances. Laura would have wanted that. She had been so adamant about it, even in her final days. Promise me, she had whispered, her voice weak but unwavering. Promise me they'll go to someone who needs them. He had promised, and he would keep that promise, no matter how many times Sarah or anyone else tried to sway him. The next morning, James called the shelter. A kind voice answered, and he explained his situation, his words halting at first but gaining strength as he spoke of Laura's wishes. Arrangements were made, and 2 weeks later, he stood outside the shelter with boxes of her clothes, the weight of them both physical and emotional. As he handed the boxes over, he felt a strange mix of sorrow and relief. The woman at the shelter smiled warmly, thanking him and assuring him that the clothes would make a difference. James nodded, unable to find the words to express the storm inside him. Driving away, he felt lighter somehow. The grief was still there, a constant companion, but so was a sense of purpose. Laura's legacy would live on, not just in his memories, but in the lives of the women she would help, even in death. And that, he realized, was the truest way to honor her. For weeks, they'd been tearing into the trash bins behind my house. My little cul-de-sac was basically their all-you-can-eat buffet. Neighbors would complain about them to each other in whispered tones, but no one did anything about it. That is, until Cheryl from 2 doors down decided to stage an intervention. Cheryl's a neighborhood mom type, the kind who organizes bake sales and passive-aggressively sends out texts about HOA violations. Cheryl showed up on my doorstep last Tuesday with her usual overbearing energy, clipboard in hand. We're organizing a cleanup and installing raccoon-proof bins, she said. We'll need volunteers to help set them up this weekend. I was already checked out. Sorry, Cheryl, I'm swamped, I said, motioning to my laptop as if I was in the middle of solving global crises. She didn't look convinced. It's your trash too, you know, she said, narrowing her eyes. Everyone's pitching in, even Tim, and he just had knee surgery. I shrugged. Wish I could, but I've got plans. The truth? I didn't have plans. Not exactly. My boss had sent me a link to an escape room promo in the city. This wild, immersive experience where you spend 6 hours solving puzzles in what's basically a Hollywood-grade movie set. It was ridiculously expensive, but they had a last-minute opening, and I wasn't about to miss it. I love escape rooms. Cheryl and her trash bins? Not my problem. When Saturday rolled around, I left early. The escape room was everything I hoped it would be. Dark corridors, actors in full character, secret doors that slid open when you pressed the right hidden panel. I was paired with strangers, but we clicked instantly. We were crawling through air ducts, cracking riddles, and piecing together ancient prop maps like a well-oiled machine. For those 6 hours, I forgot about everything else. I was Indiana Jones. I was Sherlock Holmes. I was a genius. It was only when I got back to my car, buzzing with adrenaline, that I noticed the texts. Cheryl, where are you? Tim, we could really use your help over here. Mom, why does Cheryl think you're too busy to help? It's just trash bins. Do you hate the neighborhood that much? I stared at my phone, debating whether to respond, but I couldn't muster the energy. They were just raccoon-proof bins. How was this suddenly my responsibility? I'd already gotten what I wanted out of the day, and frankly, I didn't feel bad about it. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed something strange. The cul-de-sac was dark, really dark. Cheryl and her minions had apparently taken their cleanup efforts a step further and swapped out our busted streetlights. The problem was, it made the neighborhood look unnervingly quiet, like something out of a horror movie. As I got out of the car, I heard rustling. In the bushes, then behind the trash bins. I froze. I didn't believe in ghosts or anything, but my mind immediately conjured every urban legend I'd ever heard. Then I saw them. Not raccoons. People. 3 figures in black hoodies, standing motionless by the trash bins. Can I help you? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. They didn't respond. I backed toward my front door, fumbling with my keys. The hooded figures didn't move. They just watched. Finally, I managed to get inside and lock the door. I laughed it off, telling myself it was just some teenagers pulling a prank. Maybe Cheryl's kids trying to guilt me for skipping out. Either way, I didn't care. I'd had my fun for the day. The next morning, I found my trash bins tipped over. Not just mine, everyone's. Garbage was strewn across the cul-de-sac like some apocalyptic raccoon rave. Cheryl was out there with a broom and a megaphone, yelling about community pride. Tim was hobbling around, trying to grab plastic wrappers with one of those claw grabbers. I stayed inside, sipping coffee, watching from my window. I knew what they wanted, to guilt me into helping. But why should I? I didn't owe them anything. I didn't ask for raccoon-proof bins. I didn't ask for a community cleanup. If they couldn't handle a few overturned trash bins, that wasn't my problem. By mid-afternoon, the cleanup was done. I thought that was the end of it. Then, around midnight, I heard it again. Rustling. But this time, it wasn't outside. It was in the attic. I grabbed a flashlight and climbed up, heart pounding. The attic was empty, but the air felt off, like something had been there. A faint, sour smell lingered, one I couldn't place. I figured I was just spooking myself and went back to bed. The next morning, Cheryl showed up on my porch. She looked tired, her usually perfect hair a frizzy mess. "We need to talk," she said, stepping inside before I could protest. She told me that after the cleanup, weird things started happening. Tim's new trash bins were stolen outright. Her car had been keyed. Another neighbor found a dead squirrel placed neatly on their welcome mat. Cheryl's voice dropped to a whisper when she said, "I think it's the raccoons. They're mad." I laughed. Raccoons? Seriously? Her face was deadly serious. "They've been here longer than us. We've upset the balance." I told her she was being ridiculous and sent her home. But that night, I couldn't sleep. The sour smell in the attic was stronger, and no matter how many candles I lit, I couldn't cover it. Around 3 a.m., I heard footsteps. Not on the roof. Inside the house. I didn't go upstairs. I didn't even move. I just sat there in the dark, holding my breath, listening to something shuffle around above me. The next day, Cheryl called me again. She didn't sound like herself. Her voice was shaky. She said her trash bins were back, but they weren't empty. They were filled with garbage that wasn't hers, rotten food, old shoes, broken toys. "It's a message," she said. "They know we tried to fight back." I haven't told anyone what I found when I finally went up to the attic. Just a single black hoodie, folded neatly, with claw marks across the sleeves. I haven't touched it. I don't think I want to know whose it was. But I can't help wondering, was Cheryl right? Did I upset the balance by not helping? Or is this just what happens when you put yourself first? AITA? The cold air was unyielding as it seeped through the window panes of the old house, a chilling reminder of the sacrifices they had made to live here. It was an old place, full of secrets and creaks that whispered of past lives, of untold stories etched into its walls. Clara sat in the corner of the living room, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug of tea that had long since gone lukewarm. The storm outside made the house feel even more isolated, and the flickering light of a single candle threw shadows across the room, animating the silence. Her eyes drifted to the boxes that still sat untouched against the far wall. They were relics of her previous life, a life she had chosen to leave behind. Her fingers played absently with the frayed edges of her sweater as she thought about that decision, about the months she had spent planning her escape. It wasn't easy to sever ties with everything familiar, but the suffocation of her past had left her no choice. The door creaked open, pulling her from her thoughts. A figure stepped in, silhouetted against the dim light. It was Jack, his face damp from the rain and his boots leaving muddy prints on the worn wooden floor. He glanced at Clara, a mix of exhaustion and relief playing across his features, and set down the bag he carried, a meager collection of supplies scavenged from the nearest town, miles away. "Storm's getting worse," he said, his voice hoarse. He pulled off his jacket, shaking it out near the door, droplets scattering onto the floor. "Almost got caught in it." Clara nodded, but said nothing. She watched him move about the room, the way his hands trembled slightly as he worked to light another candle. They didn't talk much anymore. The weight of everything they had endured hung too heavily in the air. Words felt futile, as if they could never capture the depth of what they had lost. When Jack finally settled into the armchair across from her, the room grew quieter still, save for the steady patter of rain against the windows. Clara reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, its edges worn from being handled too often. She unfolded it slowly, her eyes scanning the list of names written in her careful handwriting. Each name struck her like a blow, a reminder of the people they had failed to save, the ones who had trusted them. "Still keeping track?" Jack asked, his voice softer now, almost hesitant. His gaze lingered on the paper for a moment before flicking back to Clara's face. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she traced one of the names with her finger, as if doing so could somehow make amends for the guilt that clawed at her insides. "I can't let myself forget," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "If I do, then what was the point of any of this?" Jack leaned back in his chair, his eyes closing for a moment. "You can't carry it all, Clara. It's not humanly possible." She looked at him, her jaw tightening. "And what happens if I don't? Someone has to remember. Someone has to make sure it wasn't all for nothing." The room fell silent again, the storm outside roaring louder as if it were trying to drown out the weight of their conversation. Jack sighed and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He wanted to argue, to tell her that holding on to all of this guilt would only destroy her, but he knew better. Clara was stubborn in ways that both frustrated and inspired him. She carried a fire inside her that refused to be extinguished, even when it burned her. The candle sputtered, its light wavering for a moment before steadying again. Jack's eyes fell on the boxes by the wall, the ones Clara hadn't yet touched. He gestured toward them with a nod. "You gonna unpack those anytime soon?" Clara followed his gaze, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Maybe. I don't know." "You've been saying that for weeks," Jack said gently. "What's stopping you?" She hesitated, her eyes drifting back to the list in her hands. "It feels permanent," she admitted. "Like if I unpack them, it means this is it. This is our life now. And I'm not sure I'm ready to accept that." Jack leaned back again, his expression softening. "You think we'll ever get back to what we had before?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Clara shook her head, a bitter smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. No, but maybe that's not the point. Maybe it's about figuring out how to move forward, even when it feels impossible. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The storm raged on outside, the wind howling like a wounded animal. But inside, there was a fragile sense of calm, as if the shared silence was a small act of defiance against the chaos that had consumed their lives. Finally, Jack rose from his chair and walked over to Clara, crouching down in front of her. He took the list from her hands and folded it carefully, tucking it into his pocket. "You don't have to do this alone," he said quietly. "We'll carry it together, okay?" Clara looked at him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. For the first time in a long while, she felt a flicker of something she thought she had lost, a tiny ember of hope buried deep beneath the ashes of her grief. "Okay," she whispered, the word fragile but resolute. As Jack returned to his chair, the storm outside began to wane, its fury softening into a steady drizzle. The house still felt old and heavy with secrets, but for the first time, it also felt like it might one day become a home. And for Clara and Jack, that was enough, for now. The idea came to me like a bolt of lightning during a particularly dull Wednesday lunch break. I was sitting in the park near my office, watching a crow steal a sandwich out of a distracted jogger's bag, when I realized I wanted to leave. Not just my job, not just my city, my life. I wanted out of it all. The next morning, I announced my decision to my older brother, Caleb. He'd shown up at my apartment unannounced, holding a grocery bag of Mom's homemade lentil soup and his usual unsolicited advice. "Move to Alaska?" Caleb asked, lowering his spoon like I'd just told him I was joining a cult. "Why? Why not?" I countered, folding a pair of socks into my duffel bag. "I'm tired of the same grind, the same people, the same traffic. Alaska's untouched, vast. No spreadsheets, no Karen from accounting breathing down my neck. Just me and nature. And bears," Caleb added. "And snow. And did I mention bears?" "I've done the research," I said defensively. "I've got a job lined up at a wildlife sanctuary. They even provide housing. I've already sent the deposit." Caleb sat back, frowning. "And Mom? You're just going to leave her? She's been counting on you to help with the cafe since Dad died." That stopped me in my tracks. I hadn't mentioned it to Mom yet, partly because I was terrified and partly because I wasn't sure I could handle the guilt. "It's not like I'm abandoning her," I said, resuming my packing. "You're here. The cafe's been running fine without me full-time. She's stronger than you think." "Don't do that," Caleb said sharply. "Don't downplay what she's been through. She's been keeping everything together with duct tape and hope. You dropping this on her? It'll break her. Why do you always act like it's my responsibility to fix everything?" I snapped, throwing a hoodie into the bag harder than necessary. "I'm allowed to want something for myself." "You are," Caleb said quietly, setting the spoon down. "But there's a difference between wanting something for yourself and running away." I rolled my eyes, frustrated. Why does it have to be one or the other? Why can't it just be about doing something that makes me happy for once? "Because it's never just about you," Caleb said, his voice rising. "That's what family is. That's what Dad taught us." I froze, the weight of his words pressing against my chest. "Don't bring Dad into this." "Why not? He worked himself to death to give us a better life. And now you're throwing it away because you're, what? Bored." The unfairness of his accusation hit me like a slap. I wasn't throwing anything away. I was trying to find something I'd never had the courage to look for before. A sense of freedom, purpose, maybe even joy. "It's not boredom," I said, my voice trembling. "It's suffocation. I feel like I've been living a life someone else planned for me, like I'm wearing clothes that don't fit. Don't you ever feel like that?" Caleb didn't answer right away. He just looked at me, his expression a mix of frustration and something else, something softer, like understanding he didn't want to admit. "You think Alaska's going to fix that?" he asked finally. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I have to try." The conversation with Mom was harder. I waited until the cafe closed, the smell of coffee beans and cinnamon rolls lingering in the air as she wiped down the counter. When I told her, her reaction wasn't anger or disappointment. It was something worse, quiet acceptance. "I see," she said, folding the towel in her hands. "When do you leave?" "In 2 weeks," I said, feeling like the worst person alive. "I didn't want to tell you until I was sure." Mom nodded, her face unreadable. "Well, you've always been independent. I suppose I shouldn't be surprised." Her calmness unsettled me more than any shouting match would have. "Mom, it's not that I don't care about you or the cafe. I need to do this for myself." "I understand," she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "I just hope you find what you're looking for." Over the next 2 weeks, Caleb and I danced around each other. Our conversation strained but polite. Mom didn't bring it up again, though I caught her looking at me with a kind of wistful sadness that made me want to cancel the whole thing. But I didn't. The morning of my flight, Caleb showed up at my apartment again. This time, he wasn't carrying soup. He handed me a small notebook, the cover a deep forest green. "What's this?" I asked. "Something Dad used to say," Caleb replied, shoving his hands into his pockets. "He said if you're going to leave a record. Don't just disappear. Write it down. So, if you ever feel lost, you can look back and remember why you started." I didn't trust myself to speak. I just nodded, tucking the notebook into my carry-on. Caleb lingered for a moment, then pulled me into a tight hug. "Just don't let the bears eat you, okay?" he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I won't," I promised, though the lump in my throat made it hard to get the words out. As the plane took off, I looked out the window, the city shrinking beneath me. I thought about Caleb, about Mom, about everything I was leaving behind. And I wondered, not for the first time, if I was making a terrible mistake. AITA? Last Tuesday, I was scrubbing the bathroom tiles when I realized I was living someone else's life. Not in the sci-fi body-switched sense, more in the "why am I the only one doing this" way. The house wasn't even mine. I rented a room in a 3-bedroom with Amber and Jake, both of whom seemed allergic to the concept of Clorox. Still, for the past 6 months, I'd been the unofficial maid. I told myself I didn't mind. Cleaning soothed me, and honestly, I figured they'd eventually notice my efforts and step up. They didn't. Amber loved her craft projects. Translation: she turned the living room into an unlicensed Etsy shop with scraps of fabric, half-used glue sticks, and rogue glitter scattered across every flat surface. Jake was worse. He called himself a minimalist, but what he really meant was that his version of cleaning up was shoving everything he didn't want into common areas. Empty takeout containers, living room table, sweatshirts he didn't feel like hanging up, dining room chairs. My personal favorite was the time he left a half-eaten burrito on the kitchen counter to finish later. It stayed there for 3 days. I hit my breaking point during week 2 of the Great Burrito Standoff. It wasn't just the burrito. It was the principle. They didn't even pretend to care. So I made a decision. I was done. No more scrubbing the sink to lead by example. No more picking up after Amber's failed attempts at cross-stitching. I was going to let the apartment descend into chaos. Maybe then they'd understand how much I'd been doing. The first couple of days felt liberating. I walked past a growing pile of dishes in the sink and felt nothing but smug satisfaction. Every time I saw Jake's dirty socks balled up under the coffee table, I congratulated myself on my newfound freedom. Amber's glitter slowly migrated into the hallway, and I made a point not to vacuum it up. Instead, I watched it spread like invasive species. The problem? My strategy only worked if they noticed the mess. They didn't. If anything, they doubled down. Jake left an open jar of peanut butter on the counter overnight, lid off, knife still sticking out. Amber decided to try macrame and somehow turned the kitchen chairs into a tangled web of yarn. I woke up one morning to find the bathroom trash overflowing with what appeared to be an entire bag of Taco Bell wrappers. I refused to give in. It wasn't about the mess anymore. It was about the principle. Surely, at some point, someone would break, right? A week passed, then another. The apartment started to smell faintly of mildew. I couldn't pinpoint the source, and honestly, I was afraid to try. The fridge was a war zone. Amber spilled almond milk on the top shelf and just left it. Jake thought leftovers didn't count as trash, so they multiplied like cockroaches in Tupperware. I started to fantasize about moving out, but my lease wasn't up until June. Then, last night, I came home to a note on the fridge. In Amber's loopy handwriting, it said, "Hey, could we, keep the place cleaner? It's getting kinda gross." I nearly exploded. Was she serious? After months of me playing Cinderella, she had the audacity to accuse me of being messy? I crumpled the note and tossed it on the counter, right next to Jake's peanut butter jar, and stomped to my room. This morning, I noticed Jake had added his own note underneath Amber's. Seconded. It's not that hard to just, do your part, you know? Do my part? My jaw literally dropped. If passive aggression was an Olympic sport, these two would be gold medalists. I spent the entire morning rehearsing what I'd say to them. Something sharp, but not too mean. Maybe I'd mention the burrito. Definitely the glitter. But when Amber shuffled into the kitchen in her bunny slippers, I froze. Instead of speaking up, I poured myself a cup of coffee and stared into it like it held the answers to life. By the time Jake appeared, yawning and scratching his head, my coffee was cold. Amber was on her phone, scrolling TikTok, and Jake went straight to the peanut butter jar, which was still open, and scooped some out with his finger. Neither of them seemed remotely bothered by the state of the apartment. They weren't going to say anything, and apparently neither was I. So here I am, back in my room, typing this out because I'm honestly at a loss. Should I have just kept cleaning? Should I confront them? Or am I just as bad for letting things get this far? AITA? It started innocently enough, or at least I thought so at the time. My family had been planning this beach weekend for months, a classic, everyone pile into the rental house and argue over who gets the best bedroom kind of getaway. My sister Liz was in charge of the logistics, which she took far too seriously for my taste. Daily group chats, spreadsheets for food assignments, even an itinerary. It was a bit much for 2 days in flip-flops, but Liz thrives on that stuff. Me? Not so much. About a week before the trip, I got an email from a brewery a couple of hours inland. This place I've wanted to check out for ages. They were hosting a craft beer festival that same weekend. Now, I'm not a hardcore beer snob or anything, but I dabble. Okay, fine. I'm obsessed. The timing felt like fate. Still, I wouldn't have done anything about it if I hadn't started thinking about how unbearably crowded the beach was going to be. The forecast called for perfect weather, which was practically a guarantee of traffic jams, packed boardwalks, and screaming kids with sticky fingers. That's when it hit me. Why not pivot? A few quick Google searches later, I found a cozy cabin about 30 minutes from the brewery. It had a hot tub, a fire pit, and, get this, a shuffleboard table. The rental was even cheaper than the beach house. I figured if I sold it right, everyone would be on board. I mean, who doesn't love shuffleboard? The only hiccup was timing. Liz had already put down a deposit on the beach house. But when I checked the terms, it was partially refundable. So no big deal, right? I canceled it, booked the cabin, and sent a chipper message to the family group chat. Change of plans. Found an even better spot. More private, way less hassle. You're gonna love it. Details to come. The response was muted. Liz replied with a single question mark, which I ignored. My mom sent one of her classic passive-aggressive texts. If that's what you think is best, honey. My younger brother, Danny, sent a gif of a dumpster fire, which I thought was unnecessarily dramatic. But nobody outright vetoed the idea, so I figured we were good to go. Fast forward to Friday morning. Everyone was supposed to meet at my place to carpool. Liz showed up first, arms crossed, with a look that could peel paint off a wall. "You seriously canceled the beach house without asking anyone," she snapped. I told her to relax. It's not like I dragged us to some sketchy motel. This cabin was an upgrade. Besides, I added, the beach is always the same. Sand, water, overpriced ice cream. This is something new. By the time Danny and my parents arrived, the vibe was tense. Liz had apparently been texting them her grievances, and they were all on her side. My dad even muttered something about how we used to vote on things in this family. I laughed and tried to lighten the mood, pointing out that democracy is overrated and shuffleboard is forever. Nobody laughed. We piled into the car anyway, and I figured once we got to the cabin, everyone would chill out. The place was perfect, just like the pictures. I could already imagine us roasting marshmallows under the stars and cracking open some local brews. But as we unloaded the car, Liz started making snarky comments. "Oh, look at all this privacy. Just us and the bears," she said, waving dramatically at the woods. Mom chimed in with, "It's fine, Liz. I'm sure the brewery is worth it, even if it's not what we planned." Danny said nothing, but his sour expression said plenty. The real trouble started that evening. I'd scheduled us a brewery tour, but Liz refused to go. "I didn't come on this trip to drink IPAs in the middle of nowhere," she announced. Mom stayed back with her to keep her company, which was clearly code for "stop her from murdering you in your sleep." Dad and Danny reluctantly came along, but they were more interested in glaring at me than enjoying the beer. At one point, Danny muttered something like, "I hope the shuffleboard table was worth it." I pretended not to hear. Back at the cabin, things escalated. Liz confronted me in front of everyone. "Do you even realize how selfish this was? You completely ignored what the rest of us wanted," she fumed. I argued that the beach house wasn't some sacred tradition. We could always do it next year. Besides, the cabin was cheaper, quieter, and, let's be honest, way cooler. But Liz wasn't having it. "It's not about the cabin," she snapped. "It's about you deciding for everyone, like your opinion is the only one that matters." I tried to defend myself. "I was just trying to make the trip better. The beach is overrated, and this is more my vibe. I didn't think anyone would care that much." That, apparently, was the wrong thing to say. Liz exploded. "Exactly. You didn't think. You just did what you wanted, and the rest of us had to deal with it." The rest of the weekend was awkward, to say the least. Liz barely spoke to me, and even Danny seemed less inclined to laugh at my jokes. Mom spent most of her time relaxing with a glass of wine and a pointedly unread book. Dad took up whittling, or something equally dad-like to avoid the tension. The brewery was great, by the way. Not that anyone cared. On the drive home, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were all overreacting. Sure, I made an executive decision, but someone had to. Otherwise, we'd still be arguing over who got stuck on the sleeper sofa. But now I can't stop wondering. AITA? It all started when I overheard Sarah, my younger sister, mentioning how much she missed the holidays we used to spend together as a family. She said it offhandedly during one of our rare coffee dates, her voice tinged with a kind of wistful sadness that made my chest tighten. Since our parents had passed, things between us had become strained. Not out of any animosity, just the slow drift that comes with grief and the busyness of adulthood. I figured this was my chance to do something special for her, to bring back a bit of that magic we'd lost. Sarah always loved Christmas the most, so I decided to recreate one of our childhood Christmases, right down to the smallest details. Never mind that it was June. I thought the unexpected timing might make it even more memorable. I spent weeks planning. I tracked down decorations like the ones we used to have, even scouring eBay for an exact replica of the old angel that used to sit on top of our tree. I hunted for the recipe to Mom's gingerbread cookies, experimenting late at night until they tasted just right. I even convinced her husband, Mark, to let me borrow their kids for an afternoon to help with some of the crafts we used to do together. I didn't tell Sarah any of this. I wanted it to be a surprise. I set a date, told her I was hosting a family dinner, and quietly reached out to as many people as I could who had been part of those old celebrations. Cousins, family friends, even an old neighbor who used to dress up as Santa for us. It was a logistical nightmare coordinating everyone, especially since Sarah had a demanding job and 2 kids under 5, but I was determined to make it work. The day arrived, and I couldn't wait to see her face when she walked into my living room. I'd gone all out. Snowflake cutouts on the windows, twinkling lights draped over every surface, a fully decorated tree in the corner. The smell of pine and gingerbread filled the air. I had an old playlist of carols playing softly in the background, and there were presents under the tree, each one carefully chosen to evoke some memory or inside joke. When Sarah arrived, her face lit up for a moment, but it quickly fell. "What is all this?" she asked, her voice wary. "Christmas," I said, grinning. "Or, well, a version of it. I wanted to bring back some of the good old days for you." She hesitated in the doorway, her kids bouncing excitedly behind her. "You did all this for me?" "For us," I corrected. "But yeah, Mostly for you. Sarah stepped inside, but I could tell something was off. She barely looked at the decorations and didn't comment on the cookies I'd baked or the stockings I'd hung. She seemed tense, almost annoyed. I brushed it off at first, assuming it was just the stress of her day, but as the evening wore on, her mood didn't improve. By the time we sat down to eat, the tension was palpable. She poked at her plate, her eyes darting around the room like she couldn't wait to leave. Finally, she sighed heavily and said, "I appreciate what you're trying to do, but this is a lot, don't you think?" Her words hit me like a slap. A lot. I repeated, confused. "I thought you missed this." "You said." "I said I missed the holidays we used to have, not whatever this is." She gestured around the room, her tone sharper now. "I don't have time for things like this anymore. And honestly, it feels like you did this more for yourself than for me." That stung. For myself? "Sarah, I spent weeks planning this. I did it because I thought it would make you happy. But you didn't ask me if it's what I wanted," she shot back. "You just assumed. And now I feel like I'm supposed to perform some big emotional reaction to justify all the work you put in. It's exhausting." Her words felt unfair, like they were stripping away every ounce of care I'd poured into the evening. I tried to explain, to tell her about the time and thought I'd put into each detail, but she waved me off. "I know you mean well," she said, her tone softening slightly, "but you don't understand what my life is like right now. I don't have the bandwidth for nostalgia." The rest of the evening passed in a haze. Sarah stayed out of politeness, but the warmth I'd hoped for never materialized. Even the kids seemed to pick up on the awkwardness, their earlier excitement fading as the night wore on. After they left, I sat alone in the wreckage of my carefully constructed Christmas, the lights twinkling mockingly around me. I couldn't stop replaying her words in my head. Was she right? Had I done this more for me than for her? Or was she being ungrateful, refusing to see how much love and effort had gone into every detail? I don't know. I just wanted to make her happy, to give her something good. Instead, I made her angry and made myself feel like a fool. "AITA?" The wind howled against the car windows as Sarah gripped the steering wheel tighter, her knuckles pale against the dark leather. The stretch of highway ahead of her was swallowed by fog, the dim glow of streetlights barely piercing the haze. She tried to shake the unease gnawing at her, but her mind kept replaying the night's events. It had started innocently enough, a routine dinner with her college friends to celebrate Emma's promotion. They'd picked an intimate bistro tucked away downtown, the kind of place with dim lighting and an ever-changing menu. Conversation flowed easily over glasses of red wine, laughter mingling with the soft jazz playing in the background. But as the night wore on, the mood shifted. Emma began recounting an eerie encounter she'd had earlier that week, a stranger at her window late at night, the sound of footsteps in her driveway when no one was there. "It's probably nothing," Emma had said, swirling her wine. "But still, I can't shake this feeling someone's watching me." The table grew quiet, the warmth of camaraderie chilled by her words. Sarah had tried to dismiss it as paranoia. They all had. But now, driving home through the fog, her rational mind couldn't keep the shadows at bay. The headlights cast fleeting shapes onto the mist, transforming mundane trees into grotesque silhouettes. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat, making her jump. She glanced over, debating whether to pick it up. It buzzed again, a notification lighting up the screen. Unknown number. A text followed, "You shouldn't have left so soon." Her stomach dropped. Sarah snatched the phone and pulled over to the shoulder, her breath shallow. She read the text again, trying to make sense of it. Was it a prank? Her fingers hovered over the screen, debating whether to reply. Before she could decide, another text came through. "Turn around?" Her head snapped to the rearview mirror, but all she saw was the swirling fog, thick and impenetrable. A cold sweat broke out on her forehead as her thoughts raced. She dialed Emma, her hands shaking. It rang twice before going to voicemail. Desperate, she tried another friend, Claire, with the same result. The realization struck her like ice. She was alone. She turned the car back onto the road, her heart pounding with every shadow that flitted across her path. She couldn't shake the sensation of eyes on her, unseen but piercing. The fog seemed alive now, closing in, muffling the world. A sudden thud jolted her forward, and she slammed on the brakes. The car skidded slightly, tires screeching against the wet asphalt. She sat frozen, clutching the steering wheel, her heart pounding in her ears. Her headlights revealed nothing but an empty road. Trembling, she stepped out, scanning the area for what she'd hit. The silence was suffocating. She strained to hear anything. An injured animal, a rustle in the bushes, but there was nothing. Her breath came out in white puffs as she stepped closer to the front of the car. The grille was pristine, no sign of an impact. Then, faintly, a sound. It was barely audible, almost swallowed by the fog. A whisper, soft and sinister. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. She spun around, her eyes wide. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice trembling. No answer. But the whisper grew louder, words taking shape. "You shouldn't have left." She stumbled backward, slamming into the car door. She fumbled with the handle and scrambled inside, locking the doors and flooring the gas pedal. The tires screeched as she sped away, her pulse hammering in her throat. The road twisted and turned, but the fog didn't relent. Every shadow seemed to follow her, every flicker in the corner of her eye a phantom. Her phone buzzed again, but she couldn't bring herself to look. She focused on the road, on getting as far away as possible. Finally, the fog began to lift. The familiar lights of her neighborhood came into view, and relief washed over her. She pulled into her driveway and killed the engine, sagging against the seat. Her house stood dark and still, a welcome refuge. She grabbed her phone with trembling hands and glanced at the screen. 10 missed calls from Emma. She hesitated, then dialed back. Emma answered immediately, her voice frantic. "Sarah? Oh my God. Are you okay? I've been trying to reach you." "I'm fine," Sarah said, though her voice wavered. "What's going on?" "You need to listen to me," Emma said, her tone urgent. "After you left, we started getting these texts. Weird ones, like yours. But they weren't from a stranger. They were from your number." Sarah froze, her blood running cold. "What are you talking about?" "They said things about you, about tonight, things no one else could know. Claire even called your phone, and someone picked up." "Sarah, it wasn't you." The line went dead. When Jess first floated the idea of making a short film together, it felt like one of those conversations you laugh about over drinks, but never actually follow through on. Except Jess wasn't laughing. She had that look, the one where her eyes sparkled like she'd just cracked the secret to life. She was serious. I mean, I loved movies. Jess loved movies. And sure, I'd made a couple of amateur attempts back in college, but that was ages ago. Still, her enthusiasm was contagious. So I said, "Hell yeah, let's do it." The first few brainstorming sessions were magical. We sprawled out on her living room floor with notebooks, snacks, and the occasional glass of wine. Ideas were flying everywhere. Action scenes, emotional monologues, plot twists so good they made us gasp. Jess wanted to do something gritty and raw, like an indie film about two estranged siblings forced to work together. I leaned more toward a quirky, Wes Anderson vibe. "It needs humor," I said. "People love humor." "Yeah, but it needs depth," Jess argued, her pen clicking like a metronome. "We need something that leaves people thinking." We compromised, or so we thought. By the end of the week, we had a Frankenstein's monster of a script, part indie drama, part deadpan comedy. Neither of us was thrilled, but we were so caught up in the rush of doing something creative together that we didn't notice the cracks forming. The real trouble started when we began planning the shoot. Jess thought we should do everything DIY to keep it authentic. Handheld cameras, natural lighting, the works. I wasn't sold. "It's gonna look like a bad TikTok video," I said, scrolling through online rentals for proper lighting equipment. "And spending half our budget on gear we don't know how to use is better?" Jess shot back. That was the first time we really argued. Not a full-blown fight, just a tense back and forth where every suggestion felt like a jab. I wanted to focus on visuals and atmosphere. Jess cared more about the dialogue and performances. We agreed to split tasks. She'd handle the writing and casting while I took care of the technical side. It felt fair. It felt efficient. It also felt like we were quietly declaring war. By the time we started filming, the unspoken competition between us was palpable. Jess kept rewriting scenes on the fly, which threw off my meticulously planned shots. When I pointed this out, she'd roll her eyes and mutter, "It's called being flexible." Meanwhile, I spent hours tweaking camera angles and lighting setups, only for Jess to groan, "It's a 5-second shot, not a Kubrick film." Our actors, mostly friends we'd roped in with promises of pizza and IMDb credits, looked increasingly uncomfortable as we sniped at each other. At one point, Jess accused me of being a control freak, and I snapped back that she was all talk, no action. The energy on set was so toxic that even the pizza guy stopped lingering for tips. By week 3, we weren't even pretending to collaborate anymore. Jess would show up late, claiming she'd been working on edits that I never saw. I started deliberately dragging my feet during setup, just to make her squirm. When things inevitably went wrong, a botched scene, a corrupted file, we'd exchange icy smiles and say things like, "Well, someone should have double-checked that." The final nail in the coffin came during post-production. Jess had volunteered to edit, but after a few days of radio silence, I swung by her apartment to check in. She opened the door, looking guilty, and admitted she hadn't started yet. "I've been busy," she said, as if I hadn't also been juggling work and life to keep this thing alive. "You've been busy?" I laughed, the kind of laugh that isn't funny. "Do you think I've been sitting around doing nothing?" She bristled. "Oh, please. Half the time, you're just messing with filters or whatever. Editing is the real work." That set me off. Filters? Are you kidding me? Do you even know how much time I spent fixing your mess of a script? Or dealing with your last-minute changes? Maybe if you actually planned ahead? Maybe if you weren't such a perfectionist? We went on like that for hours, dragging every petty grievance into the light. By the end, we weren't even talking about the film anymore. It was about who cared more, who worked harder, who was the bigger disappointment. Neither of us was willing to back down, so we just stopped. The project was dead, and so, apparently, was the friendship. A week later, Jess sent me a link to the final cut. Against all odds, she'd cobbled together something vaguely coherent, but it was a far cry from what we'd envisioned. The pacing was off, the audio was uneven, and some of the scenes we'd argued over the hardest didn't even make it in. I sat through the whole thing, jaw clenched, cataloging every flaw and wondering why Jess hadn't fixed them. I didn't think to ask myself why I hadn't. When I texted her about it, she just said, "Well, it's not like you helped much." I wanted to scream. Instead, I typed back, "Maybe if you'd actually listened to me." But then I deleted it. I didn't need another fight. I needed to know. AITA? The rain hammered down in relentless sheets, the kind that makes the world look like it's melting. A single lamp post buzzed above me, throwing weak, yellow light on the cracked pavement. My watch read 7:12 p.m., but the darkness made it feel closer to midnight. I pulled my coat tighter, clutching the coffee cup I'd been nursing since the station. It was bitter and cold now, more like wet cardboard than caffeine, but I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. It felt like a tether to normalcy in a world that had been unraveling thread by thread. I hadn't seen Danny in years, not since the fallout at our mother's funeral. The funeral itself had been awkward but manageable, the strained civility of estranged family members pretending to care for decorum's sake. It was what happened after, the argument, that sealed the distance between us. Words were thrown like knives, cutting deep in places that had been tender since childhood. He walked out, slamming the door behind him, and that was the last I'd seen of him. Until now. The letter arrived 2 weeks ago, handwritten on thick paper that smelled faintly of tobacco. Danny's familiar scrawl danced across the page, unkempt and rushed, as though he'd barely paused long enough to write it. He needed to meet, he said. Something important. He wouldn't explain further. There was an address, a diner in the part of town that made me instinctively lock my car doors, and a time. Tonight, against my better judgment, I came. The bell over the diner door jingled as I stepped inside, the warmth hitting me like a physical force. The smell of grease and burnt coffee filled the air, mingling with faint cigarette smoke that clung to the upholstery. A jukebox in the corner crooned an old Elvis tune, scratchy and forlorn. Danny sat in the back booth, his face half hidden in shadow, but there was no mistaking him. The same sharp jawline, though now cloaked in a scruffy beard, and the eyes. Always piercing, always restless. "You're late," he said as I slid into the booth opposite him. His voice was rougher than I remembered, like gravel tumbling down a hill. "Traffic," I replied, shrugging off my coat. The vinyl seat stuck to my legs through my jeans. "What's this about, Danny?" He didn't answer right away, instead fiddling with the sugar packets on the table. I noticed his hands trembled slightly, the way they used to when he was trying to lie but hadn't yet committed to it. He glanced around the diner, his eyes darting to the door, then back to me. "Do you remember the old warehouse on 5th? He finally asked, his voice low. I frowned. "The one we used to sneak into as kids?" He nodded. "Yeah, that one. There's something there you need to see." "What are you talking about?" He hesitated, chewing the inside of his cheek. Then, leaning in closer, he whispered, "I think it's about Dad." I stared at him, the words hanging in the air like a storm cloud. "Danny, Dad's been dead for 10 years. "I know," he said, his voice barely audible, "but I think he left something important, and I think someone else knows about it." A waitress appeared, breaking the tension. She was middle-aged with tired eyes, her hair piled into a messy bun. She placed a plate of greasy fries in front of Danny and poured me a coffee without asking if I wanted one. "Thanks," I muttered, though I wasn't sure if I meant it. As soon as she walked away, I leaned forward. "You're not making any sense. What could Dad have left after all this time? And why now?" Danny rubbed his temples, his fingers pressing hard as though he could squeeze clarity from the chaos in his mind. "It's complicated. Just trust me. Can you do that?" I wanted to laugh. Trust him? The brother who disappeared for years without a word? The brother who had a knack for dragging me into trouble and then leaving me to face the consequences alone? But something in his eyes stopped me. They weren't the eyes of the careless boy I remembered. There was fear there now, raw and unfiltered. "Fine," I said, against my better judgment. "But if this turns out to be some wild goose chase..." "It's not," he cut in, his voice sharp. "You'll see." We left the diner together, the rain still falling in relentless sheets. Danny led the way, his shoulders hunched against the cold. The warehouse was only a few blocks away, its hulking silhouette looming like a ghost at the end of the street. Broken windows gaped like empty eye sockets, and the faint smell of mildew and rust lingered in the air. Danny pulled a flashlight from his pocket and flicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. "This way," he said, stepping over the crumbling threshold. Inside, the air was damp and heavy. The flashlight's beam danced across rusted machinery and broken crates, casting long shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. My stomach churned with unease. Every instinct screamed that I should turn around, walk away, leave Danny to his madness. But I didn't. We reached the center of the warehouse, where a trapdoor lay hidden beneath a layer of grime and debris. Danny knelt, brushing away the filth with his sleeve. The metal hinges groaned in protest as he pulled it open, revealing a set of narrow stairs descending into the earth. "You've got to be kidding me," I said, my voice echoing in the cavernous space. "Just trust me," he said again, and for reasons I couldn't explain, I followed him down. The air grew colder as we descended, the faint hum of the city fading into silence. At the bottom of the stairs was a small room, its walls lined with shelves crammed full of old papers and dusty trinkets. In the center of the room was a single wooden box, its surface etched with symbols I didn't recognize. Danny opened the box with trembling hands. Inside was a stack of letters, each one addressed to us in our father's handwriting. As Danny read the first letter aloud, the truth unfolded, unraveling everything we thought we knew about our family. Our father's secrets were darker than we could have imagined, and the past we thought we'd buried was clawing its way back to the surface. It started with a scratch-off ticket, one of those impulse buys you grab at the gas station counter because you have a couple of extra bucks in your pocket. I had just paid for a pack of gum and a soda, and something about the bright red and gold of the ticket caught my eye. Why not? I thought, peeling off the plastic protector with a thumb as soon as I got into my car. The numbers revealed themselves with a surreal clarity. $100,000. At first, I assumed I had misread. I held it up to the light, squinting like some kind of amateur gem appraiser. But no mistake, $100,000. The next few days were a whirlwind. First, I had to make sure the ticket was legit, so I took it to the lottery office, heart pounding. The woman behind the counter congratulated me with a bright smile and handed over an envelope containing a check. After taxes, it came to just over $70,000. Still, more money than I'd ever seen in one place. I floated out of that office, already thinking of all the good I could do with it. I didn't want to keep it all to myself. Growing up, my family wasn't rich. Every vacation, every meal out, every new pair of shoes required careful planning and sacrifices. So, I thought, why not use this windfall to give everyone a little happiness? I made a list of my closest family and friends, mentally dividing the money into slices of gratitude. First up, my parents. They'd always helped me out when I was short on rent or needed gas money. I decided to pay off their car loan and hand them $10,000 in cash. For my younger sister, I set aside $5,000 to cover her college tuition. My best friend, Liam, who had stood by me through thick and thin, would get $3,000 for a dream vacation he'd been talking about for years. I'd also throw a big dinner party for everyone to celebrate. The rest, I'd save for emergencies and maybe a down payment on a modest condo. I thought everyone would be thrilled. The first few calls were full of joy and gratitude. My mom cried when I told her about the car loan, and my dad got so choked up he had to hand the phone to her. Liam screamed so loudly I had to pull my ear away from the receiver. It felt amazing, like I was finally paying back a tiny portion of the love and support they'd shown me over the years. But the cracks started to show during the dinner party. My Aunt Linda, who hadn't made the list of beneficiaries, asked pointedly, "So, what are you doing with all that money? Keeping it all for yourself after these token gestures?" Her voice was light, but her eyes were sharp. Before I could respond, my cousin Jess chimed in, "Yeah, must be nice to win big and not think about everyone who's helped you get to where you are." I laughed it off, saying something about how there wasn't enough money to give everyone a meaningful cut, but the tension in the room was palpable. As the night wore on, more people seemed to find issues with how I'd chosen to distribute the money. My sister pulled me aside to ask why I'd only given her $5,000 when her tuition was closer to $20,000. "You know I'm drowning in debt," she said, her voice tight with frustration. Liam, of all people, took me aside in the kitchen as the party was winding down. "Hey man, I really appreciate what you did, but I couldn't help but notice you didn't include Sarah," he said, referring to his girlfriend. "She's been there for you too, you know." A little acknowledgement would have gone a long way. By the end of the night, I felt like a piñata that had been struck one too many times. The joy I'd felt earlier had turned into a cocktail of resentment, confusion, and sadness. I replayed the conversations in my head, wondering if I had been selfish or unfair. Maybe I should have spread the money more thinly, giving smaller amounts to more people? Or maybe I should have kept it all to myself to avoid this circus. Over the next few weeks, the grumbling didn't stop. My Aunt Linda called my mom to complain that I hadn't even offered to help with her mortgage, despite knowing she'd been struggling. My cousin Jess started making snide comments on social media about people who win the lottery and forget their roots. Even my sister, who I thought understood me best, started acting distant. And Liam? We haven't spoken since he sent me a text saying, "I guess $3,000 was the price of our friendship." I tried to explain myself. I wrote long messages and made heartfelt phone calls, but it only seemed to make things worse. People brought up obscure favors they'd done for me over the years, like babysitting once when I was 12 or letting me crash on their couch for a night after a bad breakup. I never asked for repayment, they'd say, but I didn't expect to be forgotten either. At some point, I just stopped trying. The money was supposed to bring happiness, not this mess. I started to wonder if I'd made a mistake sharing any of it at all. Would things have been different if I'd hoarded it or spent it all on myself? Maybe people would have judged me, but at least they wouldn't feel entitled to more. Now, months later, the money's almost gone. The car loan is paid. My sister's tuition is a little less daunting, and Liam's Instagram is full of pictures from Bali. But I've lost so much more than I gained. Family gatherings are awkward. Friendships are strained, and I feel like an outsider in my own life. I wanted to spread joy, but instead, I've become the villain in everyone else's story. So here I am, wondering if I made a mistake. Was I wrong to try and share my good fortune? Did I distribute it unfairly? Should I have done more? Or less? AITA? When I was growing up, my older sister Lana was my hero. She was the kind of person everyone gravitated toward. Funny, smart, magnetic. I looked up to her in every way, even when she teased me mercilessly or borrowed my clothes without asking. As the years passed, that dynamic didn't change much. Lana could always talk her way out of trouble, and I was the reliable one, the responsible one, the one who picked up the pieces when her life spun out of control. It started small, as these things often do. A few years ago, she borrowed my car because hers was in the shop. Just for the weekend, she promised, and I didn't think twice. She was my sister. After all, what's family for? But that weekend turned into 2 weeks, and when I finally got my car back, it was on fumes, the back seat littered with fast food wrappers. No apology, no thanks, just a casual, "I'll pay you back for the gas later." Spoiler, she didn't. That should have been a wake-up call, but it wasn't. I let it slide, just like I always did. The same thing happened when she borrowed money to cover rent for a month, after a fight with her roommate, only for me to find out later that she'd spent it on concert tickets. Or the time she moved in temporarily, after a breakup, and stayed for nearly 6 months, treating my apartment like her personal crash pad. Every time, I told myself she'd be more grateful next time, that she'd realize how much I was giving up for her. I never said no to Lana. Saying no felt wrong, like I was betraying some unspoken sibling code. She'd always been there for me in her own way, right? She called me kiddo and ruffled my hair like we were still kids, even though we were both in our 30s. I couldn't let her down, even if it meant sacrificing my own comfort. But the turning point came last year, when I landed a promotion at work. It was a big deal. More responsibility, more hours, but also a hefty raise. I finally felt like I was getting my life together. I started planning a trip to Europe, something I dreamed about for years but could never afford. It was my reward to myself, a symbol of all my hard work. When I told Lana about it, she was thrilled for me, at first. Then came the ask. "Hey, since you've got this new job and everything," she said one evening over wine at my place, "do you think you could spot me some cash? Just until I get back on my feet?" My stomach sank. "Lana," I said slowly, "you've been saying you'll get back on your feet for years." Her face tightened, but she didn't back down. "Come on, kiddo. I wouldn't ask if I wasn't desperate. You know that." I tried to explain that I was finally saving for something important to me, that I couldn't keep bailing her out every time she got into trouble. But the more I talked, the more her expression changed, from pleading to hurt to outright angry. "So that's it," she snapped. "You're too good for your own sister now? All this time, I've been there for you. Remember when you broke up with Matt, who stayed up all night talking you through it? Or when you needed someone to drive you to the ER that time you sprained your ankle? But now, when I need you, you're suddenly all about boundaries? Give me a break." Her words cut deep. I wanted to scream that none of those things she'd done for me came anywhere close to the sacrifices I'd made for her. But I didn't. I just sat there, frozen, as she gathered her things and stormed out. After she left, I felt a strange mix of guilt and relief. Guilt, because maybe she was right. Maybe I was being selfish. But relief, too, because for the first time, I'd stood my ground. The fallout was worse than I expected. Lana stopped calling. Family dinners became tense, with our parents shooting me disapproving looks whenever her name came up. I found out through social media that she told mutual friends I'd abandoned her when she needed me most. Some of them believed her. Others didn't want to get involved. For weeks, I second-guessed myself. Maybe I should have lent her the money, just one last time. But then I remembered all the one last times before this. How each time, I told myself it would be different. It wasn't until a month later, when she finally called me, that I knew I'd made the right choice. She didn't apologize. Instead, she asked if I'd had time to think things over. "I have," I said firmly. "I'm sorry, Lana, but I can't keep doing this. I love you, but I need to take care of myself too. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. When she finally spoke, her voice was icy. Wow, guess you really have changed. She hung up before I could respond. I won't lie, it still hurts. I miss her. I miss the good times, the laughs, the moments when she felt like the only person in the world who truly understood me. But I also know that love shouldn't come at the expense of your own well-being. So now I'm here, wondering if I did the right thing. Was I selfish for setting boundaries? Should I have sacrificed a little more for the sake of family? AITA,